Welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. Well, today we are going to talk about how we spend our time. One of my favorite quotes over the years is this: if you cannot offer people a vision of what they should do, you will not be able to persuade them about the things they shouldn't do. Well, our guest today does indeed have a vision about what we need to do and not do to make our life more purposeful. I love that word. And so that at the end of the day, our time here has been well spent and that we have been present. So let me introduce you to a woman I've already met, and I really enjoyed our encounter. Cassie Holmes. She is a professor at UCLA's Anderson School of Management, and her book is entitled, I'll just hold this up here, you can see it in the background with her too, Happier Hour: How to Beat Distraction, Expand Time, and Focus on What Matters Most. So this is, you've kind of got to learn to beat all the distraction that does go around out there. Now, I've got to say, Cassie, we met in Saskatchewan where you went to speak. And when I was hauling the book around, somebody said to me, "Oh, of course she lives in California. This is a totally California kind of idea." But you would argue back.
I would argue back. And I started doing the work when I was living in Philadelphia, and have been doing it across the sort of 15 years of my career. And absolutely the sort of answers and questions around time and happiness and sense of purpose absolutely extend outside of sunny Southern California, where I happen to be right now. And these are really sort of fundamental insights into our psychology as well as our experience. So yes, it's not just this sort of easy, shiny, cheery thing that is frivolous.
Don't worry, be happy kind of. It's beyond that.
Yeah.
Our conversation the day we met started by me getting off a plane and saying I had dealt with however many dozens and dozens of emails. Some days I get about 300 emails in my inbox. And then, if we've got some legislation in front of us and you complain about it, but this being busy and I'm so important, I'm getting all of these emails, is also kind of a status symbol. We must be important if we're busy. And that kind of is at odds with what you're trying to say here about the valuable use, the right use of our time.
Yeah, it's interesting because folks bucket me into time management. And oftentimes when people think about time management is this idea of efficiency. How much can you get done as quickly as possible? But that's not the outcome that we should be striving for. It's really, how do we spend our time in more worthwhile ways? And a lot of the answers for this relationship between time and happiness and well-being, it's not about quantity, even like how much you spend on a particular activity in terms of time, or even how quickly. Quickly doesn't mean better. It's absolutely about quality and spending on those activities that are worthwhile. And what is worthwhile? There are, in the research work looks at using time tracking. So looking at over the course of people's days, what activities are they engaged with, as well as how are they feeling? So you can pull out on average, what are those activities that are associated with more positive emotion? What are those activities associated with most negative emotion? What are those activities that people report as feeling rewarding? And interesting, if you look to what the research points to, it's our most positive activities are those that are socially connecting, those that are spending time with family and friends, spending time with colleagues that feels very connecting. Unfortunately, the data also points to our least happy activities as tending to be commute time, work hours, and housework. And the reason I say that's unfortunate is because sort of summing those three activities together, that comprises the bulk of our work week. But notably, That's based off of averages. And there's absolutely individuals in the data for whom their work hours are very positive. And also, it's not like all work hours are similarly negative. And it's absolutely not that all socializing feels fun.
It's positive.
And so
yeah, no.
what I encourage folks to do is to track their own time over the course of a week, writing down for each half hour, what activity are you doing? And as importantly, coming out of that time, how do you feel on a 10-point scale? And granted, it is tedious to do the tracking, but it's totally worth it because at the end of the week, you have this personalized data set that you can look at. Okay, what are those activities? And being more precise than just work or socializing, for instance, but within your work day, your various work activities, and you can see, okay, for you, based off of your ratings, what are those activities that are the most satisfying and fulfilling? You can also see just how much time you're spending on your various activities. So you can be like, and there's a lot of surprise often. It's like, holy cow, I had no idea that I was spending that much time on X. Email is that great example.
Exactly.
And with like spending that much time on email, for instance, and then the question is like, how does it make you feel? Often it's not the most satisfying of activities, but also really questioning, is that time necessary and worthwhile? Whereas you might see that there are those really important work activities that are, those things that will help you make progress, that are really sort of instrumental to the goals that you're looking to attain. And if you're not spending time on that and protecting time for it because your work days are sort of swallowed by email, this is an important insight. Throughout Happier Hour, I also share other exercises for individuals to identify for themselves what are those worthwhile activities. And if as we're thinking about those worthwhile versus wasteful activities, I think I shared with you an analogy that I think is helpful for folks to keep in mind. And it's an analogy that I continue to touch back on when making my own time spending decisions. And it's really about prioritization. And it's nicely shown in the short film I shared the first day of my class, where a professor walks into his classroom, puts a large clear jar on the desk in front of the class. And then into the jar, he pours in golf balls and they reach the top and he asks the students, is the jar full? The students nod their head because it looks full, but nope. Then he pours in pebbles into the jar and they fill the spaces between the golf balls up to the top. Is the jar full? The students nod their head, but nope. Then he pours in sand and the sand fills all those spaces between the golf balls, between the pebbles up to the top. And he asks the students again, is the jar full? And the students sort of nod their head. And then there was one more step. He pulled out 2 bottles of beer, opened one, poured it into the jar. Then he opened the other and he sort of perched himself on the front of the desk, took a sip, and he explained, this jar represents the time of your life. So those golf balls are those things that really matter to you, like your relationships with your family, your friendships, the work that you do that is really in line with your purpose. The pebbles are the other important things that matter, like your job, your house. The sand is everything else. The sand is all of that stuff that fills your time without you even noticing. And what's really important to note is that had he poured the sand into the jar first, all of the golf balls would not have fit. So that is, if we let our time get filled, it absolutely will get filled, but not necessarily with those things that matter to us. And so what's so important to do is identify what are your golf balls, put them into your time jar first, into your schedule, into your calendar, carve out and protect time for those things that matter, because the sand will absolutely fill all the other spots. But at least this way, at the end of the week, you can look back, even if you were busy, that you feel fulfilled because you have invested in those things that matter. And then one of the students was like, well, professor, what's the deal with the beer? He's like, so glad you asked. The beer goes to show that no matter how busy you are, you always have time for a drink with a friend, right? And so amidst the busyness, there also are these things that we just must make time for, because that's the sort of quality of life, right?
I just find increasingly I am I'm really making myself do that. Like even on an evening where I'm tired and would just like to go home and put my feet up and do nothing or watch bad TV, I will phone a friend that I haven't seen for a while and say, let's go for a drink. Let's go for a quick bite, something. Because, and I think maybe it comes with age too, but you just don't, you do start to figure out that that is the stuff that matters. I mean, you can always vacuum tomorrow.
Yeah, it is. And what's really astute in that is it's absolutely, and even though you're like, oh my gosh, I'm exhausted, wouldn't it just be easier to go home and watch TV? And yes, it would be easier. And you're like, I'm really tired. But what you find, I suspect, is that once you are out with your friend, it energizes you.
Absolutely.
Like it fills you and then gives you that energy. Whereas had you actually gone to relax at home watching TV, you would actually not get that same energy going into the next day. And it's absolutely those social connections that matter. And we find that in my research. So we look at what is the role of age on the types of experiences that elicit greater happiness, looking at happiness from extraordinary experiences, these sort of once in a lifetime vacations, life milestones, concert events,
Right.
Whereas also what's the effect of ordinary experiences, those sort of simple moments shared with family or meeting up with a friend for a drink, noticing nature, enjoying like a little treat. And what we find is that extraordinary experiences make everyone happy. And actually, in particular, younger folks enjoy greater happiness from extraordinary experiences compared to older ordinary experiences. As folks get older, they get increasing happiness from those ordinary experiences, such that those ordinary experiences produce as much happiness as those extraordinary experiences. And what's really interesting in this, it's sort of savoring those sort of simple pleasures and moments, but it's not about age per se. Because what we have found is that younger people tend to view their futures as expansive. As you get older, people tend to recognize that, in fact, their time is limited and therefore precious. And therefore, savoring and recognizing the wonderfulness in even those ordinary experiences. And so when we actually make younger people recognize that, in fact, their time is finite, is limited, then they start to savor more. They find also joy in those simple, ordinary experiences. And I think that's so important because these ordinary experiences are accessible and available to all of us. And there is a lot of happiness right there in our daily lives, in the time that we're already spending. And, in that busyness that so many people feel, this sense of being time poor, of not having enough time to do all that you sort of set out to do, that, again, sort of touching back to something I said before, it's not about quantity and how much time you have available or even how much time you spend on your various activities. It's absolutely about quality and sort of noticing, like noticing the good stuff.
And it's also like there's a difference between sitting there dealing with 300 work-related emails, which just, impacts the blood pressure in not a positive way, or watching, for some people, their pets. You've got one on the red chair there behind you. She's turned her back on us, by the way. So
don't take offense.
She's making a statement. But the picture of the grandkids on Instagram, my neighbor at the lake the other night. So I'm sitting in Ottawa, she's in Saskatchewan. She sends me a picture of lightning over the water, a thing that we've seen 1,000 times since we were kids. And she said, love watching lightning over the lake. And I love so. And that just stopped me in whatever I was doing at that moment and just took me right there. And it was huge, just, I don't know, restart, it took a second, not going and visiting with a friend, but it was almost the same because it was a shared experience, right?
Absolutely. And that the sort of, there's the noticing nature and noticing those moments is so powerful. And also there's interesting work that looks at the role of awe, and watching lightning over the vista is absolutely awe-inspiring. And there's other sources of awe through social connection, for instance, watching other achievement, but nature is one. And there's interesting work that shows that from experiences of awe, it actually makes us feel more time affluent. It makes us feel less limited in how much time we have, because it's that sort of expansive feeling. It, like, all those sort of worries and sort of, about the day's schedule dissipate. And really, it's like it puts stuff into perspective. And there's so much power in that, not only emotional sort of satisfaction, and when you share it with someone, even virtually, that sense of connection, but really a sense of greater sense of belonging and connection, which is so powerful.
You used in the book, talking about how we feel. We live in a culture that, and this is not just how we feel, it's kind of reality, that we're time poor. We never have enough time. We need to do this and we need to do that. As you say, some of it's busy work, but we feel that way. And then you talk about trying to create moments where we feel time affluent, like we've got it on our hands, and therefore we can do something with it. You also make another point, which I thought was really interesting, that, and this is research that you've done. I should say, now, she's a professor of marketing and behavioral decision making. This is real research you're doing, that if we give away a little bit of our time to help, to contribute, to volunteer, you give away a little bit of the time, it makes you feel like you have more time. How does that work?
Yeah, and it's so counterintuitive, right?
Yeah.
Because actually, and sort of touching back to that feeling of being time poor, that feeling of not having enough time to do all that you set out to do, it is very prevalent. So I know you are in Canada, but among an American sample, and I suspect it's not so different, we found that nearly half of Americans feel time poor. And though moms tend to feel more time poor than dad, and working parents, particularly if your partner works, tend to feel particularly impoverished, we see in the data that all types of people feel this way, including those without kids and including those who aren't working for pay.
Yep.
And it's not only prevalent, but the problem is quite serious, because it has these detrimental effects that when we feel like we're limited in the time that we have, when we feel time poor, it makes less of us. It makes us feel less and behave less. So it makes us less healthy, that when we feel like we don't have enough time, we don't exercise, we neglect exercise, we delay going to the doctor, we eat fast food because it's fast, not because it's healthy. It makes us less confident in being able to achieve what we set out to do. It makes us less happy. And related to the effect that you're asking about, what we see is also it makes us less nice. When we feel like we're in a rush, we are less likely to slow down and help others out. Yeah. But in our work, we found that when people actually give some time, it increases their sense of how much time we have. And to your question, like, how is that possible? And what it stems from is the sense of self-efficacy, because this feeling of being time poor is not feeling like you have the resources, the temporal resources, to achieve what you set out to do. And there's a subjective element of like confidence in being able to achieve what you set out to do. So self-efficacy is really important there. And what we found is that when people give time, then they help another, it makes them feel really effective. It's like, holy cow, I accomplished a lot with that bit of time. And then that gives you a sense of like, wow, I can accomplish a lot with the time I have. And it sort of broadens the sense, expands the sense of how much time you have, making people feel more time affluent. And it's interesting because there, you can also think about like, okay, what are some other activities that increase that sense of self-efficacy that could also then have this expanding sense or effect on how much time you feel like you have. Another that I hypothesize is exercise, actually. Because, as I mentioned, exercise is one of those things that people neglect when they feel time poor, but exercise, research points to, it's a very effective mood booster. It helps offset anxiety. It helps offset depression. It also increases self-esteem. It increases your sense of being able to sort of be effective in your life and in not only in your body, but in your life. And so even when you feel like you don't have the time, by carving out time to exercise, it has these really positive effects, physical, as well as emotional, as well as expanding sense of time.
The other thing that I was really that really resonated with me, I'll put it that way, is you talk about the purpose filter. Why do you do what you do? And remembering all the while that an obligation is not the same as purpose, right? I feel obliged to do that. I've got to go see my Aunt Tilly, and I don't even really like her, but I'm going to do it. It's not the same as that more serendipitous kind of, there's someone who needs help across the street, and I'm going to stop, damn it, even though I'm running, and help that person. It makes you stop and think about why you're doing what you do.
Yeah. And when I, was saying, how do you identify your golf balls? So one way is to track your time. Another is to identify your purpose. And actually, different people have different, and purpose is your sort of like ultimate goal. Like, what is driving you? What is your why and all that you sort of do, that sort of underlying why. And an exercise that, and I also will admit that sometimes it sounds really like intractable and lofty, like trying to identify what your own purpose is.
Your purpose is, yes.
Yeah.
Meaning life, yes.
But this exercise that I describe in Happier Hour, called the 5 Whys exercise, is very helpful for this, because you ask what do you do? And this could be related to the work that you do, but it is really like, where do you dedicate your efforts and time? Like, what do you do? And then asking yourself, why? Why do I do that? And then your answer for that, if you have a job, it's usually sort of your job description. Some people say, well, it's actually, the money. Well, it's like, well, why is that important to whatever your answer was? And then you go 5 layers of why, asking yourself, whatever your last answer was, well, why is that important to me? And when you get to that sort of those layers, that 5th layer of why, it is very revealing, and it uncovers what ultimately drives you. And again, it will be different for different people. And this is such a helpful thing. I teach MBAs at UCLA. And, these are very ambitious students, folks, adults, who are getting their degree so that they can be, quote unquote, successful. But what does successful mean, right? And it can be quite demoralizing when you're it's this vague sense of what success is, and you're assessing how you're doing by looking at how others around you are doing. And there's always going to be people who are doing better, and they might be on dimensions that you don't ultimately care about, but you see them doing better. So it makes you feel like, oh, that's what success is. But the 5 Whys exercise, by identifying your own purpose, it is so helpful, because then it's very clear to you. What success is you achieving and working towards that particular goal, your own individual purpose.
And it may not be pretty the first time you look at that. I mean, on some simple level, if you just say, oh, well, I want to be rich and famous, and I want to, make tons of money. But if you keep saying why to that, then you have to stare that in the face too.
Yeah. But at least, and it might not be pretty at first. And if you see there's a sort of gap between your current state and what your goal is, then that's the motivator. That's the thing that you should be striving for and working for and making decisions and dedicating your time in that vein. It's much healthier and ultimately more intrinsically motivating and feeling of rewarding than what we tend to do is actually compare ourselves in the gap with other people.
Right.
And so, yes, it might be an opportunity to sort of kick yourself in the butt, but it's worthwhile to identify that. So at least you have direction on where you're going to dedicate your time and effort and talents.
Everybody, I think, believed, and I'm starting to think more and more mistakenly, that somehow living through the pandemic and all of that was going to make us much more self-aware. We were going to appreciate the small things in life. We were going to cherish our friendships and never get back on that, treadmill again and work 22 hours a day. It's amazing how quickly we have reverted to old, sometimes not great habits. And then you have the other group of people who've said, hell, I'm not going back to work, right? I'm going to do 2 days from home, or I'm going to, whatever it is. What are you seeing out there? I'm assuming your research is kind of ongoing about how did we learn anything, and did we learn anything positive out of that?
I mean, it's so fascinating. As you said, like I was writing the book during the pandemic. Right. And in a lot of the underlying research and psychology was the same. So in the work that I already described, of like when we realize our time is limited, it makes us savor more, and that can be activated by age, but it's really the sense of time. And then we're in the pandemic, and everyone was reminded, forced to reckon with the fact that, in fact, our lives are finite. Our lives are fragile, and our time is precious.
We're mortal. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it sort of put everyone into this sort of savoring mode. And actually, my editor was like, oh, is this going to be like old news? And I was like, you know what, I suspect. And also people were so relieved almost that their schedules all of a sudden were wide open. And they're like, I will never, overschedule myself again. It took like no time at all for people, to jump back in. But some of the learnings, both individually as well as organizationally, and this is, what folks are grappling with right now, was this recognition of like, okay, time is precious. People are sort of more in tune to their sources of meaning and are more in tune to like commute time is, as I mentioned, the research points to, is time that feels very painful because it feels like a waste. You're just trying to get through it. And then all of a sudden they didn't have commute time. And then trying to go back and, absorbing this commute time yet again feels particularly painful for folks, and they're quite reluctant. What's interesting, though, is while there's that learning, okay, are there ways that we can minimize commute time? Maybe it is fewer days a week. Something that also got lost, which the time tracking and the research all points to, is that really that value of social connection.
Yeah.
And not having any time in the office, you are losing that connection with your colleagues. You're losing that connection that happens, through mentorship and learning. And research points to actually really the critical role that having friendships within the workplace play on people's sense of engagement with their work, their satisfaction with their work. And so there's this, as we're sort of, what learnings can we take to be thoughtful of how we sort of set up our professional lives and our sort of organizational structure, and how we construct our work week, is hopefully folks, organizations are being thoughtful is like, okay, there can be some time saved from commuting, but it can't be completely because you don't want to lose those connections that sort of engage people within their organizations and the work they do, as well as make them feel satisfied and fulfilled, not just in their work lives, but their lives more generally. There's an interesting, in the Gallup data, or in the Gallup poll, there's a question that sounds silly because it sounds like something my fourth grader would ask is, do you have a best friend at work? And while it sounds like a silly question, and it is very predictive of very important things like engagement, job performance, job satisfaction, as well as life satisfaction. And in the my recollection is the sort of recent reading on that within the US, only 2 out of 10 Americans say that they have a best friend at work, but those who do are twice as engaged. Their job performance is so much higher. And so understanding and thinking about how do we cultivate friendship such that you might have a best friend at work, as we sort of figure out how to, quote unquote, go back to the office or set up our work weeks.
No, I mean, I've spent most of my life in newsrooms and very, intense, but very collegial atmospheres. And it's really, really true in terms of, because you, in addition to just the support and having friends around and enjoying your time there, you have another level of commitment. Because if you don't do your bit, you're letting down somebody that you care about. And so the organization benefits, we benefit, it's really an interesting dynamic that's at play. And if you're in a crowd of strangers, you just don't care as much.
Yeah. And actually, I mean, a little bit off this, but related to something that we said before, and I think is important to point out here is like, when I'm talking about happiness, again, it's not this sort of frivolous passing thing.
Yes, yeah.
There is a lot of research that shows that when we feel happier in ourselves, in our lives, it makes us show up better for those around us, both in the workplace as well as in our interpersonal relationships. There's research that shows that when we feel happier, it makes us more creative. It makes us more adaptive in our problem solving. It makes us more collegial, more collaborative in our negotiating styles. And then it also, so it's like by taking care of your emotional well-being, it does make you a better team player, as well as actually a better leader. And that's not just within the workplace, it's also outside of work. Studies show that when we feel happier, we like other people more. We are liked by other people more. It makes us nicer. It makes us kinder. We're more likely to help others out. And so this sense, and also there's also work within the organizational or business setting that happy employees are more engaged, they're better performers. And you actually see that it sort of translates into an improved bottom line for recruitment, retention, as well as actually customer engagement. If people are happier, then your customer sort of feels it as well. So all of this is to point to, and the reason I brought it up, as you were saying, that it's like, yes, having friends at work, it does make you feel better, and it makes you a better team player, and the feeling better is important.
Yes, no, exactly. But you get satisfaction, of course, as we've discussed, from lots of things. And if you're playing off somebody else, and because I find that when you're around other people, obviously ideas come forward in a way they wouldn't if you were sitting by yourself. So you do get smarter and better and more engaged. It makes me think, though, because there's still folks that are having trouble reintegrating or don't want to reintegrate. And his work, he's I think one of the most interesting social scientists out there, Robert Putnam, who wrote this book called Bowling Alone. And to make it so simplistic, he basically says more people in America are bowling, but they're not bowling in leagues. They're going by themselves to the bowling alley, hence the title. And I'm wondering if we are doing way too much of that, is being alone together in the world, and not getting that connection, that benefit, even though we are around other people or in proximity to other people.
Yeah, and it's really important to keep our eye on, because loneliness is the most direct route to depression. Yeah. And depression absolutely makes us unmotivated. Like it makes us almost stop, and it is very consuming, and absolutely something that we need to be careful about. And figuring out, okay, how do we offset loneliness? How do we invest our time? And what's interesting is looking at, the role of social media. And the research looks at it as like, actually, it depends on how you use social media. Exactly. If you are spending your time passively watching other people's lives, that actually, it makes us feel lonelier. It makes us feel more isolated. It also, through social comparison, makes us just feel worse about ourselves. You see those negative effects on self-esteem and happiness. But when people use social media actually as a way to stay connected and to cultivate relationships that are already existing, to keep in touch and see those your friends' grandchildren, or keep in touch to see your friend having that experience of watching the lightning, and that you feel connected in that to the extent that you're using it as a way to stay connected with existing relationships, it can actually be very positive. And what you're noticing, and what I'm saying is, it's absolutely the role of connection that is driving the positive versus negative effects on social media. And what's also, sometimes when I use the word, because I talk a lot about the value of social connection, younger folks who are in the sort of digital natives, where they're like, oh, connection, that comes through social media. That's not the connection I'm talking about. Yes, you can have more connections, but that isn't a sense of connection or a sense of belonging. And so it is so important that, and actually you can do this again, I already mentioned the time tracking exercise that you can identify for yourself over the course of the week. Oftentimes those activities that are the most positive are those ones that are actually feel connecting. And then you can identify for yourself, what is that for you? Like, for me, I'm an introvert. And so I found actually in the time tracking that for me, it's really one-on-one conversations, whether it's with a friend or colleagues, are very connecting, versus the cocktail parties or the group dinners. Right. But for some individuals, it is the cocktail parties, those big group settings, that make them feel really connected and offset loneliness. So it's important to identify for yourself, what are those times that you can spend, activities that you can do that offset loneliness, that make you feel connected. And it is so important to invest your time that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I said this to you before, but it reminded me of what Steve Jobs said, which is, your time is limited, which we've been talking about. So don't waste it living somebody else's life. But that means you have to do your homework. You have to do that tracking. You have to follow your heart, your instincts, and really figure out what is it that is making your life positive, that it does feel like you have purpose. We need to work at it.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, I've been talking a lot so far with respect to time about the hours of our days, what activities do we spend on today? But in our work, we actually find that when people take a broader view of their time and think in terms of their years and their life overall, as opposed to hour by hour, then we see that those folks are happier in their days, feel a greater sense of meaning and satisfaction. And one of the drivers of that is that when people take this broader perspective of time, which highlights, what is really important, what are those values, then it makes them spend on activities that are important, not simply urgent, because so often we are sort of moving through our days and responding and spending time on things that seem urgent, irrespective of their importance. And so thinking about, like, what are those golf balls? But also and you can, yet another way to identify your golf balls is by taking this broader time perspective, life perspective, and seeing what ultimately matters to you. I have my students, and in the book, I talk about this exercise of writing your eulogy. And folks initially are like, oh my gosh, no, thank you. Like, I don't. But what it does is it's not actually an exercise that involves death. It is really about leading you to think about your life, projecting forward to the end of your life. How do you want to be remembered?
Right.
What do you want people to say about you? What legacy do you want to leave? And in articulating that, what it really does is it brings to surface your values. It's like, what ultimately does matter to you? And that informs what is important, can inform, like in our lives, can inform how we spend our hours today. What are those activities, those things that we need to carve out time for? And yes, it is those relationships. Yes, it is the work that really matters to you, that sort of purpose, the why work, right?
I work. Absolutely. That's such good advice, honestly, because at the end of the day, that's what we do want. Like, what mark will we have left, on this massive planet, and so therefore what matters to us, right? And it all comes from the why, and try and figure.
Yeah.
So great to see you again and chat. This is really terrific. The cat, I'm just informing you, has turned around just a little bit. So I think she finds you more interesting than she did a moment ago.
Well, thank you. This was such a treat to see you again.
Yeah.
And to help sort of dig into some of these insights that I hope
really is.
Help folks.
Yeah, I know it will. Happier Hour, how to beat distraction, expand your time, and focus on what matters most. Cassie Holmes. So you have a great time. Enjoy your day. Go pet the kitty. and I hope our paths cross again.
I do too. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, bye-bye for now. And thank all of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallin. And we'll see you soon.